Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Love, Rinse, Repeat. I am here today with Geoff Thompson. Geoff, hello.
Hi Liam, and everyone else.
And for everyone, for those who don't know, Geoff is the Coordinator of Studies Systematic Theology at Pilgrim Theological College, part of the University of Divinity. His writings include Disturbing Much, Disturbing Many, Theology Provoked by the Basis of Union, Jesus Christ According to the Basis of Union, the forthcoming Doctrine, a Guide to the Perplexed, and today we are talking about his new book, A Genuinely Theological Church, Ministry, Theology, and the Uniting Church, which you can pick up today, and I highly recommend it. So, Geoff, thank you very much for joining us.
Good. Pleasure.
So I thought we'd just do a couple of preliminary getting to know you questions, but it's still very on theme. So I guess this book is about the vocation of theology or the practice of theology. What drew you to theology in the first place, to this study in this area?
Sure. I suppose it was a consequence of a call to the ministry of the word. My faith hadn't been formed in a context or the church culture where there was a lot of explicit theology. And it was actually through coming to study to prepare for ordination that I was exposed to Christian theology, and then discovered that I loved it and found it engaging and compelling. I think for me it was less. Some people say, come to theology and you ask the question, why haven't we heard all of this before? And often that for some people is about, there's a whole stack of stuff I don't have to believe that I thought I had to believe. There's a bit of that, but I think for me it was actually, my response was discovering there's this whole field of intellectual inquiry that just is part and parcel of the church, of Christianity. And that's what I found exciting and liberating, that this Christian faith was something that could be explored, interrogated, as well as received.
Yeah, that's great. So then, now that you're where you are now, you're involved in the theological education of others. So I guess, what is it you love about your role in theological education, or about the theological education broadly?
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of educators, and I think maybe it is particularly the case for theological educators, for the reasons I was actually talking about a moment ago, is that there's this sense of seeing people's eyes light up. I mean, quite literally sometimes in classrooms, or some expression of the penny dropping, that people discover something about the Christian faith that they either didn't know about or they weren't sure about. And I think it's also this notion that was true from my experience about comprehending that there is this field of inquiry. We're not the first people or the first generation to be asking questions of the Christian faith, and the Christian faith is something that gives itself to questioning. And I think it's when people grasp that, that's what I really enjoy. And I think studying theology and teaching theology in this context, and we'll probably talk about that a bit later, is really, I enjoy that too, because it's a time when, in a sense, you can ask anything. There's a sense in which everything is up for grabs.
Yep, that's exciting. So, yes, let's turn to the book more specifically and maybe briefly set up the context or the conversation that you're entering into with this book. What are some of the questions or recent developments that you've been responding to or trying to address?
Sure. I guess I've been as a teacher in theological colleges for 18 years, and in both appointments I've had have been in the context of the Uniting Church. And I think for nearly all of those years, there has been some or another review, whether assembly synod level going on about theological education, the theological colleges, and all that's right and proper. And many of those have led to really significant shifts in our thinking about our theological colleges, how they're to be resourced, what kind of curriculum they offer, and of course the entirely appropriate reflections on how do theological colleges, as part of a ministerial formation program, prepare people for ministry today in the context that people are going into. But it dawned on me at some point that actually there's a question we weren't asking, and that was, well, why do we bother with the theological education at all? Why not just talk about ministerial education? But we've hung on to this idea of a theological education as part of a process of ministerial formation. And my argument has been, as I began to engage these conversations, that we actually weren't asking that question. And therefore you'd actually diminish the role of theology in the process, because it without a clear understanding of why you're studying theology, or you want your ministers to be theologically informed, it simply becomes a hoop that you have to get through. And I think it actually offers a lot more to the process of ministerial formation than simply being a hoop you have to get through.
Yeah. So I guess as you're trying to set up, why study theology, it's good to have an idea of what theology is, which your book provides a robust and dynamic definition of theology. So I'll read that out so everyone knows what we're kind of dealing with, and then we'll jump into a few bits specifically. So theology is the church's ongoing, historically shaped, critical, imaginative, and constructive reflection on the biblical witness to the early Christianity's puzzling proclamation of Jesus of Nazareth as Israel's suffering Messiah and the world's reconciling Lord. Spinning off and around this pivot, it shapes the Christian vision of God, creation, salvation, sin, evil, community, ethics, and hope. This vision unfolds in sometimes expanding and sometimes contracting concentric circles, and sometimes along unexpected tangents. As it does all this, theology serves the church's cultivation of its social imaginary, and thereby nurtures its worship of God and its missional vocation. So, in a moment, I wouldn't mind unpacking some phrases and some implications within that definition, but I guess maybe even before that, I guess maybe what have you found, what's the most, maybe the hardest or the most helpful thing in actually having to put down on a pen and paper in a book that everyone reads, this is what I think theology is? Like, how is it to set about making a definition of theology?
Yeah. Well, one of the difficulties is finding something that's not too long, and I'm not sure that I actually met that criteria in this one. But on the other hand, maybe that doesn't really matter. In fact, that's probably what I would argue, because I think a lot of the formulaic definitions we have that we've received from the past actually aren't all that helpful, because they actually reduce the horizon in which we think about theology. What's the difficulty? I suppose one of the chief difficulties is what is it that we're studying? And ultimately, in studying God, we're not studying a reality that is immediately to hand. And therefore, the definition of theology that we give has to honour that. But it's not to do so at the same time. You have to combine that with the reality that or the conviction that we do have something to say, and that the Christian faith gives us license to actually say things about God. So I think part of the difficulty is holding those two things together. It's combining a sense of modesty about the task, but also a confidence that the task is doable.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll kind of get to a bit of how that, I guess, intersects with your understanding of confession a bit later in the interview. So moving to the definition proper then. So my first question concerns like the word imagination or imaginary in its two different forms, which appears twice. The first is that theology consists of an imaginative reflection of the biblical witness. And the second is the claim that theology serves the church's cultivation of its social imaginary. And what sparked your interest, I guess, in this relationship between imagination, and theology and doctrine? And I guess maybe for those who are interested, and they'll get more of this when they inevitably buy and read the book, but how do we understand this concept of social imaginary?
Well, actually, I was glad to have the heads up about this question, because I had to stop and think, where did the interest in imagination come from? Because I actually don't detail that in the book. And I reckon there were two books that I was reading way back in my theological formation, and that just got me interested in the question of imagination. So one was a comment by Karl Barth in his volume 3, part 1 of the Church Dogmatics, and he's talking about is engaging in the creation narratives from Genesis. And he's talking about the struggles that historical critics of the Bible in the 19th and early 20th centuries had to find the appropriate categories for these texts. And he comes up with his own, which is the category of saga. But in the course of that, he refers to the chronic lack of imaginative fantasy on the part of the historical critics of the 19th and early 20th century. And that got me asking then, what is the place of imagination in conveying the truth? I mean, obviously the biblical writers, and I think this is what Bart was trying to put his finger on, is that the biblical writers themselves are imaginative writers. And likewise, not likewise, but so much as I think another thing he was saying was that the historical critics were trapped in an understanding of knowledge that was objective, rational, and which denied the capacity of seeing outside those categories, or having a mode of knowledge outside those categories. That was one thing. Second thing was in probably various books, actually, in various writings by Walter Brueggemann. I mean, famously in The Prophetic Imagination, but then in some of his, particularly probably struck me more with some of his books on preaching, where he talks about imagination as a way of seeing, and something that and he particularly talks about preaching as a tool for helping people reimagine reality. So I think that those issues sparked an initial interest. But then I think as time has gone on, I've begun to realise that, well, imagination has a role to play in epistemology. How we know anything requires an imaginative faculty, a capacity to see things. So I think it has a certain philosophical importance as well. And I think it's entirely appropriate as a tool for thinking about modes of knowing God.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's helpful in the sense of it's so often dismissed as that which is imaginary can't be real or true, but it's not that at all, because you're right, it is so tied to any form of knowledge.
Yeah. But I think what it does, and I suppose this is particularly, I mean, Brueggemann, I think, is very strong on this. That we have an imaginative capacities means that we can see things differently. And I mean, he gives a political edge to that. In the sense that we don't have to see things the way the empire tells us we have to see them. And of course, that comes out of his engagement with the Hebrew prophets. But I think the other thing that is, I'm not sure if he actually uses this term, but I think it's implied in what he says. The imagination helps us to see through things as well, to actually see where deception is taking place. Yeah. So, go on.
Sorry, and I guess that again moves towards a bit the social imaginary.
Yeah.
And what that is and how it needs to be formed.
Yeah. Well, and here I look at the terms used by various people in different disciplines, but I've latched on to the particular way Charles Taylor talks about it in his writings, particularly in his big book on secularism. So I mean, I think imaginary is what is produced. That's the outcome of us using our imagination. The imagination is the faculties, or the faculty that we have for seeing and knowing, and the imaginary is that which is produced through that process. The social imaginary, and again, to use Taylor's terms, it's the implicit sense of what holds us together as a society and what makes us a society, what makes, what conditions what we think is normative for that society. It conditions what we think, how we think we should relate to other societies. So it's something that is implicit, but that it has this socially binding role of a society being able to think about itself as a society. But it's also something, and I think, I mean, this is particularly helpful or a particularly helpful insight from Taylor, I think, is that I think in the hands of some people, the social imaginary is something that can be very static. But what Taylor does, that big book of his, is about how the West's social imaginary changed. And I think I like the idea of the social imaginary, and particularly the way Taylor unpacks it, because it actually gives the society agency over its own imaginary. It's not something that's, we're all conditioned by this. Now, there's some of that, but we actually are able to engage that imaginary and be critical about it, and when occasions demand and circumstances require, it can be changed. Or to be most social imaginaries are changing all the time.
Yes. Great, thanks for that. So the second thing I want to draw out is kind of two phrases.
Could I just go back
to
that? Because what I didn't say was why that's relevant.
Good.
Because I think I use the social imaginary in the book merely as one way. I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about the way theology functions in the church, so that the church has indeed its own social imaginary. And one has to say churches have their own social imaginaries as well. But, or perhaps what could be said, Christianity there is a social imaginary that attaches itself to Christianity. And I think it's a helpful way of thinking about the role of theology. Theology isn't the social imaginary, but theology feeds the social imaginary by the kind of work it does. Theology helps the church as a society think about, well, what holds it together as a society? What does it think is normative for society? And theology, I think, has perhaps a particular role in being and giving to the church agency in that development of the social imaginary by the sorts of questions it asks and some of the conclusions it might come to by asking those questions.
So it can help maybe shift the social imaginary in ways that are kind of maybe bring it more in line with a kind of the will and ways of God kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, at its best. At its best, that's what we do. Yeah. I mean, of course, it can also be, bad theology can deform the social imaginary as well and change it in ways that take it away from that that notion of the ways of God.
Yeah. Okay. So the next couple of phrases I want to draw out of this definition is you have a phrase, the early Christianity's puzzling proclamation of Jesus, and the shaping of Christian vision sometimes takes unexpected tangents. So you have puzzling proclamations, unexpected tangents, and now I know from your other work you have a warmth for the idea of strangeness, I guess drawing out of the basis. So you are a coordinator of systematic theology, and yet here we have puzzles and tangents and strangeness. None of this seems, very suitable for the development of a nice, clean system. So I guess we're here, and how are these things related, or how do they hold together in your mind?
Good question. I guess the first response is to say that it is not the purpose of systematic theology to produce systems of theology. This is one of the unfortunate things about the use of the adjective systematic, which is a relatively modern adjective that's been placed in front of theology. In earlier eras, we would have just talked about doctrine or church teaching. So, but systematic theology, I think, essentially, is that aspect of theology that looks at how the different elements of Christian faith and Christian belief and Christian conviction relate to each other. And so it's systematic in the sense, I would actually see it systematic, the adjective systematic carrying in many ways a much more interrogative function than simply or having the burden to actually produce a system. It's actually asking questions about how the doctrine of creation relates to resurrection, for instance, or how does salvation relate to providence. For those sorts of, all of the Christian ideas are in one way or another interrelated with each other. And I think systematic theology, at its best, is pursuing those relationships and seeking to identify them and articulate them. Now, having said that, of course, there are many systematic theologians and a tradition within systematic theology of producing systems that shut down, that try to produce an overarching global perspective, a meta-narrative, if you like. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done within the church's understanding of systematic theology about what it is. But I actually think it's helpful to keep the word because it does point to the fact that there are these connections between Christian beliefs. We don't just receive this random collection of discrete, unconnected items of belief. I think probably the person who's certainly helped me, and I think her thoughts have been helpful to many in defending systematic theology, is Sarah Coakley, and her notion of theology totale, which is Christian theology rightly aspires to a sense of the whole. And she says the more systematic we are in that respect, the more we will discipline ourselves to attend to that which is neglected and ignored. Which actually, by doing so, can break the systems, or at least systems that have been constructed, or at least open up the boundaries of those systems.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So the final bit about this, definition of theology I want to draw out is less about the quote, but building back into an earlier section. So the puzzling proclamation I just mentioned before is about Jesus of Nazareth as Israel's suffering Messiah and the world's reconciling Lord. So this reaches back to a point you make in the previous chapter about the novelty and peculiarity that characterized early Christianity. And you make this connection of the importance of this for our contemporary context and needs. So I guess, how does the novel particularity reshape how we think about theology in and for the church today?
Well, I think it's related to the cultural context of the church in the West in particular. And I think it has a particular relevance to the Australian context, which has peculiarities and distinctive features that I don't think it shares even necessarily with North America or Europe, with where we're mostly compared. And it has got something to do with, and I know we're going to talk later about post-Christendom, but this sense in which we have moved into a context where either people do not know about Christianity, and I think we underestimate the reality that there are many people in Australian society who know very little about Christianity at all. Some of my best theological conversations are actually at supermarket checkouts. And one I had recently was with a young woman, I suppose she was early 20s, and she asked me what I did, and I told her and explained a little bit about what it was. And she said, "Oh, yes, I know a few Christians." And I just thought that was incredibly revealing that she would actually say that I know a few Christians. This was this was not normal for her friends or in her networks. But I think that's very much the context. And so people either don't know, or what they know creates hostility because of, and the church has responsibility for generating the reasons for that hostility. Or Christianity is possibly so well known that nobody cares about it anymore, because it's been around for long enough and it's got this place in Australian society. So I think you've got all of this going on, and the sense of Christianity being something new, something novel, something peculiar has been lost. And I think it even gets lost when we apply categories like religion, spirituality to it. They pigeonhole it, and you can't actually say this is what's distinctive about it. So I think there's a sense in which Christian theology today, or the Christian faith today, is better news for the world than the world realizes. But I also think it's better news than the church often realizes as well. And that's what I think is why it's relevant to theology. I think this sense of, and to theological education, this sense of this newness, this God who does really, really strange things, like identify himself with a criminal or someone who dies as a criminal's death. And this just turned everything upside down in the imagination of those first Christians. They had to really wrestle with this. And I don't think they necessarily came up with a whole lot of neat answers. And I think that's what I think this sense of novelty and peculiarity is something to be recovered, not only to meet the cultural context of the church, but for Christians to be reminded ourselves that we are dealing with a most unusual God in terms of the way the word God has been understood over time and in different cultures. And so I think that's how those issues relate.
That's really good. Thank you. Which that kind of this how we talk about this leads into an important section of your book, which is the tackling of theological vocations for the church. And the first of these is confessing, witnessing, and testifying in a post-truth age. You establish confession as a way of truth-telling that kind of breaks apart the binary of this objective facts and opinion. Could you share a bit more about this vocation of truth-telling, and perhaps any ways you've seen it practiced or lived out in the church?
I think that two answers to it. One, in terms of, if you like, more fundamental theological method and the nature of theological discourse, is that I think confession, using the discourse of confession or the modes of confession, testimony, witness, I think are precisely the disciplines that cause us to be modest about our theological claims. I think I would want to also say that it's the basis on which we develop convictions, but convictions must be articulated modestly and with humility. So I think that's what our willingness to appropriate those categories does to the way we talk about God. Mm. I think in terms of something that I've seen in contemporary church life that embodies this, I think is with Love Makes a Way. Love Makes a Way. And more broadly, the church's engagement with the question of Australia's treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. Christians have, and others as well, but I'm just going to talk about the Christian motivation for that. In a sense, you can only go so far with arguing the moral failure of Australia's practices in this regard. And you can only make certain headground with arguing for moral virtues of doing it otherwise. And there comes a point when the church has to simply confess that this is the government's practices are wrong, and that there are better practices that the Australian community or Australian government could take on. And I think for me that the sense of urgency about that embodies the kind of context in which the church's theological discourse that disciplines itself to confession, witness and testimony actually takes shape in a practice of protest.
Yeah, that's a great example. So since we just mentioned post-truth...
I just realised the light's gone off here. Is that...
Oh, that's fine. We can still see you fine. Yeah, but we've got this. I want to take a brief tangent. You're the keynote speaker at the upcoming School of Discipleship conference, which I'll be attending here in Sydney. And you're talking about discipleship and conviction in a post-truth age. So I guess any chance I and the tens of people listening could get maybe a sneak peek into your thinking on the topic, and maybe this is especially helpful for those who won't be at the conference, of I guess how is discipleship different in a post-truth age? You don't have to give away the whole farm here, but any kind of little... hints would be fine.
Well, in one sense, it's not different at all. Discipleship still consists of those basics of loving our neighbour, loving our enemy, visiting those in prison, clothing the naked. So I think what's different is when there is a cultural mood that says any of those activities, any of those practices are simply done out of a personal or the preference of a particular community, and that they actually have no foundation, and that to do the opposite has equal moral value or equal moral foundation. So I think the difference is we need to be, ready to defend our reasons for living this way and making the claim that they have foundation, and that in fact, and to make arguments that to fail to do these things is itself a moral failure. And so I think it's part of, since it goes back a little bit to the answer to the last question, we do need, I think, to ensure that the way we act, the way we speak are consistent with the gospel. And that's going to be increasingly challenged, I think, in the more the post-truth mindset gets a hold.
Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge. Well, I'm looking forward to the next weekend. Great. So back to the book. Another vocation you propose is the development of scholarship in a post-liberal age. You argue that theological colleges and the multidimensional discourse they develop should themselves be cast as part of the mission of the church, meaning we shouldn't just see colleges as places that prepare ministers to go and lead that mission somewhere else. Again, how might you envision this missional engagement of theological discourse and scholarship? Maybe again, like how have you seen it, or how could you see it look?
Sure, I think it's what the colleges already do, because for as long as I've been around theological education, theological colleges do all sorts of things other than teach people theology to prepare them for ministry. They are often places of debate, discussion, seminars, resourcing the church through workshops, speakers, etc. So I think it's about how, and again, I suppose this has a particularly not in church context, but how the church thinks about what the colleges are. And so what I'd like to see is a shift in our thinking about the colleges, that what they're doing is already missional. It's already part of the mission of the church. Having said that, I think what the colleges perhaps can do more of is actually expand the range of conversation partners that theology is engaged with. I think, and one of the reasons I say that is because I think we are in a context where, and we often hear political parties talk about, what narrative do they tell, or what narrative of Australia are they offering to the rest of Australia? And I think we're in a time of competing narratives, and narratives that are actually getting more and more complicated because there are more and more people part of the conversation. So I think one of the things that is a challenge for the theological communities, I think, is to expand the range of conversation partners so that the narrative we tell is rich enough to be a worthy conversation partner in this broader conversation about what reality is, what the world is, what life is that is going on all around us at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, really good point. So the last section of your book rests on the belief that the context we are in, and that's the context we are preparing ministers for, is best understood as post-Christendom. We flagged this a little bit earlier on. So this is a hotly contested and probably largely misunderstood term. And I guess to set you the really easy task, could you just clarify a bit what you mean by what is the post-Christendom maybe specifically in the Australian setting?
Sure. Again, good, an important question, and it is a contested term. Look, I use it, I think, in two broad ways. One is the sense of the post-Christendom nature of the West generally, and where we've moved out of a time where there was this very close integration of Christianity with the cultures, the institutions, the texts and narratives of Western culture. That was Christendom. That's broken down. And so Western culture, with its roots in Europe but having spread beyond Europe to outposts like Australia, is now clearly post-Christendom in that respect. But then I think there's a way we might use it internally in the church as well, and then even more specifically in the Australian context. So you might think of culture as post-Christendom, but then churches, I think, have to think of themselves as being post-Christendom churches. They're no longer churches for Christendom. Or actually, I think many of us try to be, but it's just we've got to let go of that. So we need to make that adjustment in thinking about where do we derive our identity from, and I think that's a task for a post-Christendom church. But then I think another way in which we use it in Australia is that we think of the church, the Protestant churches particularly in Australia in the 1950s and 60s, as the norm, where the churches were strong, they were robust institutions, they had a very particular range of particular social roles. The spokespersons, the leaders of the church were frequently called upon to make public commentary, etc. And that's the kind of the time in Australia, which was actually something of an aberration in terms of the integration of churches within Australian society. That's the time where I think many of us, that was our own Christendom, when this close integration of the church and Australian culture, but it was incredibly short-lived. By the 1970s, it was gone. And I think we are still in Australia adjusting to that. And I think particularly in the mainline churches who knew that that was their heyday, we are still adjusting to that situation. So, yeah, I think it is a contested term. It can mean different things. But I think it does have a particular, I think it has a particular, the third meaning that I addressed there is the one that I think has a particular relevance to the Australian church.
And I think that's really helpful in setting up for the latter part of the book is exactly how do we be a church and how do we, train people, prepare people for this particular kind of church. And so this context, you argue, calls for a particular type of leadership, and so a particular type of theological education. And this leadership, you kind of say, has two vocations, one being hospitality and neighborliness, and the other proclamation and prophecy. I guess what led to these two vocations? Why do they rise to the top in the post-Christendom context, the post-Christendom church?
Yeah, again, knowing that something along those lines was coming up, I actually had to go back and read that bit. I thought, did I actually say that? And I mean, I knew I'd said that, but I thought, how did I relate those to this particular context? And I think the notion of hospitality and neighbourliness and linking them to leaders, I think, is reflecting the different posture that church leadership has to show towards the world. Now, I think many of our church leaders do show it. Thank goodness for that. But I think there's still a kind of internal church culture shift that has to take place, that we don't expect our leaders to be people who automatically have a voice in our society. And if they don't, or that we should, nor should we expect that they're people who can mix it with the levers of power and the institutions of power. So that it's perhaps less a comment about how leaders should lead, but as much about what the church expects of its leaders, and that rather than being people exercising that kind of Christendom style leadership, actually a style of leadership that is much more about hospitality and neighbourliness. And I think also in terms of, I think it's related also to this notion I talked about before, these multiple narratives that are going on within Australia, the numerous voices. Christian leaders, I think, have to be able to engage those other communities, those other voices, be able to hear those other voices and engage with them. And that requires hospitality and neighbourliness.
Yeah.
And proclamation and prophecy, I think that's got something to do with the confidence that we have something to say, something distinctive, and it's a confidence that perhaps has to be relearned in our new context, where it is easy to think that with the demise of Christendom, we're going to lose our confidence, and maybe we had a kind of confidence that actually has to be lost. But there's a confidence that to proclaim all that is entailed with proclaiming Jesus as Lord. But prophecy also in the sense that we have the confidence to speak truth to power as well. And sometimes that's an internal matter as well. Speaking truth to power in the church is a task. But I'm also thinking of the way in which the confidence that we have in the gospel, in the words that we use to articulate it, will be sufficient for our leaders to speak truth to power.
Yeah, great. They fit really well in this time as you've set it up. So that's great. So to close, I want to sort of read a brief section on post-Christendom theological education, which comes very nicely out of this last thing you were saying. And at the end, you can either just say yes and amen, and we'll be done, or you can, add another little word to it at the end. That's up to you, and I'll be surprised by what you choose. So here we go. So a post-Christendom theological education concerned for Christian particularity in the midst of plurality, rather than with intra-Christian doctrinal divisions, could produce ministers who are drawn into the excitement and destabilization of the contrapuntal voices in Scripture, who have an awareness of the dynamic and imaginative depth of Christian doctrine, who are energized rather than paralyzed by the irresolvable ambiguities of the Christian life, but who are also humbly confident in the gospel, not least in the face of the resilience of evil and the shadow it casts over the church and the wider world.
I think I'm happy with yes and amen.
Great. Well then, Geoff, thank you very much for joining us today. The book is A Genuinely Theological Church, which you can pick up everywhere now, and I encourage you to do it. We've only just scratched the surface on our conversation today, and there's so many good gems, and particularly for folks in the Uniting Church and being formed by the Uniting Church currently, I say it's very important, but even its contribution to the wider church is also very valuable. So, Geoff, thank you for joining us today. Anything else you want to shout out or promote in this moment?
No, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Thanks for the conversation and for giving the book a plug. Appreciate it.